IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. So today we have with us Anushka, Saxena and Amit Kumar, both research analysts at the Takshashila institution. I'm Bharath Reddy, and we're going to be talking about strategic vulnerabilities and how it's different from dependence. So to just set the context for the discussion, so dependence and vulnerability are two different things, right? So for example, getting a mobile phone from a Chinese vendor is very different from the risk involved for a country is very different from getting a Chinese vendor with close ties to the Chinese state to build out the entire telecom infrastructure of the country. So this kind of a distinction is not very commonly understood in popular debate, and especially with usage of terms like Atmanirbharta, which kind of doesn't make this thing clear. The risks involved in being dependent or being vulnerable are lost in this kind of a framing of the topic. So Amit, you've written a paper trying to draw the distinction between dependence and vulnerabilities. And Anushka, you also looked at how states respond to these kind of vulnerabilities. So let's get started on understanding the need for such a definition in the first place. Why do we need to have this distinction? And maybe later we'll get into the framework that you can use to...
Thank you, Bharat. I'll just state out, as you said, dependence is quite different from vulnerability. And of late, these concepts have creeped into the strategic landscape. Therefore, the purpose of writing this paper was twofold. So the first entails that the evolving global perspectives on concerns arising from asymmetrical trade interdependence, right? So one would ask, why have these concerns surfaced of late? So two reasons. China's increasing willingness of late to weaponize trade as a tool of coercion. We saw them doing it against the Koreans, the Japanese, and Australia in the past 3 to 4 years. And second, the pandemic-induced disruption that we witnessed beginning 2020, it reinforced the existing problem with the current nature of the supply chains, which has China at the center of most of them. And together, these factors led to the discussion around decoupling beginning 2018, if I'm not wrong, from decoupling from China and the narrative towards centered around self-sufficiency. And like it happened in other countries, such debate also gained traction in India. Anyway, governments across the world have a thing for protectionist policies, and India was no different. The second reason why this debate has become important, especially with respect to India, and this is a very a factor that is specifically relevant to India, is that the deterioration of India-China relations post-Galwan. So India and China India has a huge trade deficit with China, and it has been a thorny issue between the two countries. But somehow we have been so far able to manage this thing. But post the Galwan clashes of 2020, this trade relationship, which was heavily skewed in favor of China, became unsustainable. And there were calls all around the country to ban imports from China, as import dependence makes us vulnerable to China and it gives them strategic advantage to our adversary, right? So the central argument in both these claims were that dependence-induced vulnerability in an asymmetrical trade interdependence vis-a-vis China was strategic and thus critical. Now, there were also talks around, so there was no particular, and what this did was it incentivized the government to take a one-size-fits-all and broad-based approach to all sectors of trade that we have with China. And this was the case even with the other countries. So there was broad-based attempts towards broad-based decoupling. So there was a need, although it is true that there is a strategic character to trade that it has acquired, but it also addressing them will have some economic trade-offs, right? So there's a need for clarity over what dependence means. Is every form of dependence a vulnerability? Is every vulnerability strategic? And if yes, are they critical? So this was the idea behind writing this paper. And the very fact that from 2018 to 2023, that we have moved from decoupling, and the narrative has shifted from decoupling and self-reliance towards diversification and de-risking, suggests that there's a lack of clarity among policymakers as to how to go about. So this was the need and why we at Takshashila chose to work on the topic.
Anushka, anything else you would like to add here?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to kind of look at the policy framework that can determine the difference between these often interchangeably used terms. And personally, my observation with this phenomena that has been induced by both the kind of approach countries are now taking towards an increasingly hostile China that is willing to use economic coercion, as well as to the disruptions that were induced by the pandemic. We're observing that the nature of international trade, although as Amit pointed out, which has always been strategic, it's now transforming from what we previously understood was a win-win manifestation of comparative advantage to a tool that is kind of meant to not only expand one's own comprehensive national power, but to also restrict and strangle the growth of another. So that, I think that has also come to be a central feature of these efforts towards diversification and de-risking. And at the same time, in the past few years, the focus of geopolitical relations has also shifted to kind of seeking risk actively and pursuing industrial dominance. So that kind of explains why dependency is being referred to from a broad-based approach, because now countries increasingly want to take the risk of whatever, having labor costs induced on them, or have their own industrial setup stranglehold it, just so that they can expand this kind of competition and contestation with some other potentially rival nations or nations that are sitting at the hub of certain critical supply chains, and any disruption can kind of cause them to break those easily established value chains.
Right. So basically, to summarize it, so nations are willing to use dependence and vulnerabilities to exert pressure on their rivals. And so, but at the same time, you need to be when you're trying to advance your own interests as a nation, you need to differentiate between dependence, vulnerabilities, and
Right.
Amit, like you spoke, there are different levels of vulnerabilities as well.
Right.
So let's move on to the framework that you have come up with to identify this distinction and to systematically look at it. So how do you classify these kind of vulnerabilities, and what is the framework about?
So the framework that I have discussed in my paper, it tries to make a distinction between not just dependence and vulnerability, but it envisages a 4-stage situation constituting of dependence, vulnerability, strategic vulnerability, and critical vulnerability as a set of 4 concentric circles. So wherein you have dependence towards the top, then as you go inwards, you find vulnerability, and then there is not every vulnerability is strategic, and not every strategic vulnerability is critical. So this is how I have conceptualized these 4 terms. So now dependence in a trade relationship could be defined as a form of reliance, wherein a party A relies on party B. That could either be seller-based, that is upstream, or buyer-based, downstream. And the degree or severity of dependence, just because there's a dependence in a relationship does not mean that it's a vulnerability as well. So there has to be something that has to go along with dependence to make that relationship a vulnerable relationship. So the degree or severity of dependence can create conditions of vulnerability. In this sense, vulnerability is a case of dependence that is tied to some high probability disruptive factors. This could be anything ranging from natural disaster, that the place where the supply chain is located is vulnerable to things like natural disasters, or it is vulnerable to high taxes, high protectionist measures, or any other factor that makes that situation much more vulnerable, right? So this is the main distinction between vulnerability and dependence. Now, strategic vulnerability is a subset of dependence-induced vulnerability that is driven by strategic motivations of an adversarial state, which can have geostrategic or geoeconomic implications on the state exposed to that said vulnerability. So you need to have a geopolitical component for a vulnerability to become a strategic vulnerability. And for this, my paper envisages 4-stage test called the adversary test, the substitutability test, incidence test, and cascading effect test. So the adversary test, as it's very clear by the terminology, it examines whether a case of dependence or a vulnerability is vis-a-vis an adversary. Here it is important to include extended adversaries as well, which may not fit into the definition of our traditional definition of adversary, but these are states which are increasingly susceptible to one's adversary's pressure. For example, in India's case, it would be Russia. Even though it does not fit our definition of an adversary, it may qualify as an extended adversary because of its relationship with China. Once a case of dependence passes the adversary test, it needs to be put through the substitutability test that determines the presence of economically viable alternatives to the product or service in question. For a case of dependence vis-a-vis an adversary to become a strategic vulnerability, it must meet any of the three case scenarios. That is absence in this test of alternatives. That is the absence of alternatives, either source or product. Second, the demand is so large for that particular product or commodity that existing alternative cannot meet it in the short run. And third, the switch cost to an existing alternative is too high. Having met the above two conditions, that is the adversary test and the alternative test, this specific case of dependence shall also pass at least one of the two last tests that has been that I have set out in my paper to be categorized as strategic vulnerability. The incidence test measures the impact of disruption on the general population against two factors. That and it entails the section of population affected and the product's utility for the populace. So if there's a luxury product that only caters to a specific 1 to 2% of the population, that need not, even though we are dependent in that sense for our 100% of import from our adversary, it need not be a strategic vulnerability. Likewise, if a product, even though if 40 to 50 or even 60% of the population is affected by that case of dependence, but if the utility of that product for the larger population is not high, it again cannot be identified as a strategic vulnerability. For example, India's reliance on China for soft toys, decoratives, firecrackers. India is exceedingly dependent on China for these stuffs. But this case of dependence cannot be, in my opinion, classified as strategic vulnerability. So this is the test of incidence that it must pass. A specific case that would pass this test, I mean, not other tests, but specific example if I have to give you, then India's close to 40% dependence on made in China electronics would qualify for both these parameters. Although it's a different question if it would be a strategic vulnerability, because we'll have to test it on other parameters as well. Lastly, the test of cascading effect. This measures the impact of disruption in the traded product on other domestic sectors within the value chain and beyond. So a plausible example could be India's dependence on, for this specific test, could be India's dependence on China for active pharmaceutical ingredients, for which India is dependent on China for 60% of its supplies. And any weaponization or disruption in this regard could restrict India's capability on two fronts: the production of generic medicine and its status as the pharmacy of the world. So these are the four factors that we need to take into account, to which we should apply to all cases of dependencies individually to identify if that particular case of dependence is a strategic vulnerability or not. Beyond that, we also have critical vulnerabilities. So my contention in the paper is that all strategic vulnerability are not critical vulnerability. And it is, and therefore, it is important to underline that not all strategic vulnerabilities are similar. Some may be of more severe or critical nature than the others. And in this sense, critical vulnerabilities again are a subset of strategic vulnerabilities. And to delineate these category of critical vulnerabilities from the pool of strategic vulnerabilities, two additional tests. I identified two additional tests that test these cases of dependency across national security threat and the capability gap. So any case of strategic vulnerability that poses a direct threat to national security and can offer adversaries disproportionate leverage over us would qualify this test and be a candidate for a critical vulnerability. For example, dependence on adversaries' investments or technology in electricity grids, communications, satellites, banking and finance, digital infrastructure, command control communications, computers and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance related sectors. So if a country has a dependence on these sectors, they are highly susceptible to cyber attacks, which gives adversary a very direct advantage, which it can use to make disruptions within the other country, right? And the second factor is that the case of strategic vulnerability has to be relating to a particular product, wherein the adversary has a sophisticated and specialized technology which cannot be replicated in short to medium term by us, and it could instead take decadal efforts to bridge that gap. So if one is dependent on the capabilities of your adversary for advanced chips, precision weaponry, space technology, missiles, etc. So these are the factors which would amount to critical vulnerability.
Right. So you speak of 4 different levels of vulnerabilities, and can we maybe take an example from each of these, from dependence to vulnerability and strategic vulnerability and critical vulnerability, to make this distinction clear? So you already spoke of critical vulnerabilities. The examples would be public infrastructure or
digital infrastructure,
electricity grids or something like that. Right? What about in strategic vulnerabilities? Would API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, qualify as a strategic vulnerability in that sense?
Strategic. So as I said,
any other examples that you can?
Not really. I'll have to. In specific case of India, I'll have to look. But I mean, yeah. So I have examples for each of these particular cases, but we have still not gone to that stage where we have. I looked at the entire trade basket between India and China, and identified those specific cases that would qualify for these respective categories, right? So the idea was first to get the conceptual clarity, but yeah. So but the example is the example that for the specific case of a test of strategic vulnerability that I have already given. So, for example, India's dependence on China for electronics, that it amounts to close to 40%, I think. So that meets both the adversary test and also the test of incidence and test of cascading effect. But whether it meets the test of alternatives, that we need to be sure, because there might be other candidates in Southeast Asia who also engage in assembling of these equipments, right? So we'll have to closely look at if we have viable alternatives and those 3 cases of alternatives that I spoke of. So yeah.
It's a more detailed analysis where you look at each product, each
product, and we
run it through these different tests. So even if your electronics are cheaper in China and they account for the largest, a very large part of our imports, doesn't mean we're vulnerable, because you might have an alternative even if it's slightly higher priced. Right. So we'll move on now. But before we do, we'll take a quick break and we'll come back to discuss how different states have responded to these vulnerabilities. Welcome back. And we'll be now talking about how different states have perceive these vulnerabilities and how they're reacting to it. And Anushka, would you like to take us through the different kinds of responses that typically states of all kinds have identified in dealing with what they perceive as vulnerabilities?
Right. Thanks, Bharath. So actually, except for the European Commission, which has only reacted with a full-fledged concept paper on what they understand to be strategic dependencies and vulnerabilities. It came out in April this year. We haven't seen any other state propose a framework to differentiate between dependence and vulnerability, or for that matter, go deeper, as Amit has, into differentiating between strategic and critical vulnerabilities. But if I have to talk about some of the wider ranging responses to the sheer perception of threat in terms of asymmetrical trade interdependence, there can be multiple, right? So I personally think it can be fourfold. The observations are fourfold. One is that countries have responded to their idea of vulnerability against a potential exploiter by supporting the development of domestic capabilities. So this is one of the 4 inward acting kind of reactions to this idea of reducing dependence and seeking dominance in a sector, right? So one of the ways of doing this is you drive indigenous innovation, right? So for example, the US Chips and Science Act is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of this and when you think of techno-nationalism, right? So in 2021, the US said that it reportedly lost $61 billion in automobile sales because there was a lack of availability of chips, which are mostly packaged and exported from countries based in East Asia. So these woes were, of course, also exaggerated by the ongoing tensions in its relations to China. So to respond to this challenge, what the US did is that it proposed the Chips and Science Act to empower its domestic chip industry to fill in for these demands that the external actors were previously fulfilling. And this involved a monetary infusion of around $300 billion, a little less than $300 billion, of which specifically around $13.2 billion were assigned for research and development and workforce enhancement. So that was inward looking in the sense that it wanted to drive domestic innovation and capability. The second method to do this would be to support domestic actors through monetary incentives. So the Chips and Science Act also had such tax breaks and other kinds of incentives for domestic producers to keep looking inward, detach themselves as much as possible from future projects that may perhaps come up in China. For example, the chip manufacturing center that Intel was planning to launch in China. So the US instead said that you invest this money in your own country. And of course, this kind of bolsters one's own capabilities while also forcing a strategic alignment between the government and the private enterprises, thereby kind of coercing the latter to keep looking inward and keep their capabilities restricted to the national territory that is kind of trying to reduce its or mitigate its vulnerabilities. The second way the second observation is outward acting, which is when countries try to weaponize access to domestic markets. So, of course, China does this really well. So, what it would do is that it would put up a host of market access barriers that kind of undercut foreign competition and thereby reduce its perception of vulnerability. So, for example, China is the world's largest food and grain consumer, but its domestic production capabilities are unable to match the ever-growing needs of its population. So, what it has done is that it has imposed import bans on a variety of agricultural products to hinder market access from competitors, and it serves a twofold purpose, right? One is that it will kind of try and hit a rival nation, which is the United States, and this was increasingly, like food imports was increasingly one of the weapons we were seeing being emphasized in the trade war that was launched by Donald Trump in 2018. And it would also impose other non-tariff barriers such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures on food imports from countries such as the US and the UK to mitigate over-dependence. And the second fold of the purpose it serves is that it can bolster some of its domestic capabilities on food production, thereby, contributing to the narrative of Made in China 2025, self-reliance, so on and so forth. Then the third observation is that countries have responded with the idea of diversification. So suffice it to say that besides the kind of run-of-the-mill quest to self-reliance, supply chain diversification has emerged as the top policy response to reducing vulnerabilities in international trade and in asymmetric interdependence, right? And a lot of this conversation on reducing dependence on China in the pandemic, aftermath of the pandemic, for example, which has focused on decoupling and now de-risking, is actually working on diversification to look for alternatives, to look for distribution of supply chains across various hubs to mitigate dependence-induced vulnerabilities. And Japan is an interesting case in this regard because Japan is not only encouraging diversification of its firms that operate abroad across countries that are Japan's friends. So like it's doing a form of diversification called friendshoring, where it's asking its firms abroad to invest in ASEAN countries and move away from China. It's also practicing this diversification internally because a lot of the concentration of supply chain resources happens in the capital hub, which is Tokyo, and Tokyo is very vulnerable to natural disasters. So what Shinzo Abe's economic policy focused on this a lot, especially his basic policy on economic and fiscal management and reform, where he's very argued, and subsequent Japanese governments also argued, that these Japanese firms that are concentrated in Tokyo should relocate production centers either abroad in friend countries or internally in other cities so that threat from natural disasters is mitigated. And finally, the one response that can be observed on a broader level globally is partnerships. So like-minded countries, and by like-minded, I mean here countries that either feel that they have a similar type of vulnerability or dependency in a specific center, or countries that feel that they have dependencies or vulnerabilities in multiple sectors against a similar rival or a similar set of adversaries, or both, right? And these countries kind of aim to mitigate their vulnerabilities by coordinated policy responses. They utilize existing partnerships or even form new ones to achieve mutually desirable goals. So, for example, the EU has agreed that China is a systemic rival, and now it is leading a de-risking response against it. So, this is one coordinated action by a partnership that already exists. And in March this year, I think the European Parliament also adopted an anti-coercion instrument to allow it to retaliate against countries that choose to employ economic coercion against its member countries. So, for example, China against Lithuania. And some partnerships that have come up are those between, say, the US, the Netherlands, and Japan, which have kind of joined hands to restrict exports of semiconductor materials, lithography tools, and so on to China. And this is meant to kind of mitigate their perceived vulnerability from China's rise as a global leader in high tech, while also reducing the possibility that any dual use, that is civil or military technology, can reach China's hands. So, yeah, I think that would summarize it.
Right. So we've seen a lot of these different kinds of interventions coming out in the past few years. So, like, for example, one thing that I can think of, which I was recently studying, is related to ORAN, which started off more from telecom service providers trying to diversify their supply chain, but now states are using that more as a geopolitical de-risking instrument that are trying to bring different countries together to see that they're not so vulnerable on a rival telecom equipment coming from there or something like that. So you see a lot of, also even the PLI schemes that we have is a form of one of the responses to strategic vulnerabilities that you talked about that India is pursuing. So you see all of these developments happening off late, and you'll probably see a lot more going forward. So just to conclude, we've seen all of these kind of interventions playing out. You see that technology is very closely related to national power. You see that tech companies are getting more influenced by the priorities of the countries that they're headquartered in. The states are trying to influence the decisions of their countries, incentivize the way where they're located, things like that. So you'll probably see that escalating to different forms in the coming years as well. So how should India tackle these kind of things? Should we have one is, I think we need to have a discussion where we come up with a framework to analyze, to study the areas where we are vulnerable. But beyond that, what would your thoughts be on the actions? I mean, the things that India needs to do to maybe address some of these kind of.
So, as I already said, that there are certainly certain economic trade-offs when you try to address these cases of dependency and vulnerabilities, right? So, you have to therefore optimize the level of intervention that you can make, because it will have an impact on your consumer base, on your developmental pattern, and on developmental goal. And the thing is that you cannot wish away China. The elephant in the room is China. The entire debate has come to the fore because of China's centrality in the global supply chain, right? But you cannot also not wish away China. China will be there, and China has been there in the global supply chain and will be a major player going forward in this entire debate. So you have to selectively look at, as I said, selectively look at things that are strategic and critical to your interest, and make minimal interventions on those sectors itself. The other cases of dependency where you are not strategically vulnerable or critically vulnerable, unnecessarily government intervention will bring down total factor productivity. And that might not, if you're, as an Indian, if I'm looking at 20 years down the line, and I want to imagine India where it is catching up to China, I don't think we should make those unnecessary interventions where we can bring our own productivity down and make dent our own potentials. So this is how I look at it. So normal cases of dependency and vulnerability, which are not strategic and critical, they should be left alone, and they are actually the areas where we can actually benefit from China.
Right. Anushka, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think just on this, I think recognition is the first process where you kind of put a framework in place where you differentiate between these things, thereby thinking of where to implement the policy. But one thing I would say, Amit said what we should do. One thing that comes to mind when I think of what we shouldn't do is PLI schemes for everything, because in the discussion on what our vulnerabilities or dependencies are, the question that should automatically also arise simultaneously is what are our strengths? And if we try and incentivize domestic production in each and every aspect of trade, ranging from semiconductors to something as basic as towels and toys, right? So if we kind of march forth to even replace our dependence on Chinese toys, then there is no stopping, right? And we had this discussion in office today as well, where we got to know that sunset clauses are a problem in PLI schemes. So we never know when they're going to end or what is the credit limit that is feasible to provide a certain sector. So without those elaborations in our PLI scheme policy and the over exaggeration of the idea of self-reliance, with that in place, I think it would be difficult to kind of see exactly where you need to invest. And as Amit said, optimize your policy response. So that would definitely be one thing from the Indian perspective of what we shouldn't do.
And just to add, if we have PLI schemes for each and every sector, we might end up investing less on our strengths, right? And we might end up losing where we would have had an advantage and we did not end up capitalizing on it. So,
right. And you have a limited budget. You need to prioritize what you need to do. Human development, all of these also, require investment, and there are things that we need to prioritize over maybe, getting toys from making toys in the same country, right? So this has been a really fascinating conversation. I look forward to, how all of this plays out and to studying more about it as well. So thank you for joining us and thank you for listening in.
Thank you, Bharath.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.